Now, you want to know what's going to happen? If Donald Trump walks into this meeting with the distorted view that you have just outlined, nothing happens. Absolutely nothing happens. And I don't think Donald Trump privately believes anything that you've just said. I think he knows the truth. He's repeating this narrative spun up in London, New York City, and Washington because he thinks he has to, because he's got donors, because he's got globalist European governments in London and Paris and Berlin who keep repeating this nonsense. And he feels he has to maintain that fiction. But when he sits down at the table, the truth is very, very stark. Ukraine is falling apart. It's crumbling. The Russians aren't inching forward at 1,000 meters a day. They're finishing off what is left of the Ukrainian army. We have always focused on territory. The focus of the Russians has never been territory. It has been the annihilation of the Ukrainian military threat and the government in Kiev. Well, the Ukrainian military threat is just about gone. The best that they can do right now is beg, borrow, and steal whatever missiles the Germans, the French, or the British will provide to them, and then hurl them into Russia in the hopes that this will convey the impression in the West that somehow or another they're still alive and well. They're not. It's over militarily. Done. The war is ending. The question is, what do we want to do about it? That's really the issue. Now, I'm sorry to interrupt you about this, but I deal with this all the time. And Mario, I'm just sick of the lies.
So I did hear your last interview. You said the same thing. It's hard to verify, on the Russian side, they don't release many numbers. On the Ukrainian side, obviously, they're going to be very biased. British intelligence are saying 1,000 men per day are dying on the Russian side. But I just don't know what source to believe because there's no accurate objective figures.
Could the Russians recruit 35,000 new volunteers to fight in the Russian army every month if they were taking the losses that MI6 insists they're taking? How many times do we have to be lied to by the British? I mean, we have been manipulated by the British since 1916, 17. We've never gotten through it. We continue to be manipulated by the British in London. If anything, the Ukraine project has become increasingly an MI6 project supported by London. I think, again, Donald Trump knows this privately. The question for him as an American president is, how do you get out of this? And I think he'd like to get out. Just as he once made it very clear to me and others, he wants to get our troops out of Iraq, out of Syria. He ultimately wanted to get us out of Germany. I think inwardly, Donald Trump is the same way. The other thing is, and something that nobody's paying attention to, is that Donald Trump is turning increasingly to the serious problems we have in the United States. That's why he sent the National Guard and, federal marshals and others into Washington, D.C. The crime statistics that are published publicly are nonsense. It's much worse. And he knows that. He's also privately ashamed, as many Americans are like me, that our capital is such a disgrace. It is a disgrace. And somebody said, well, there are fewer rapes and murders and thefts and assaults. I said, look, first of all, I don't believe that. Secondly, one murder, one rape, one assault in Washington, D.C. is too many. Washington, D.C., and I remember it because I'm old enough now, was a place that in 1960 you could walk from one end to the other without fear of anything. That's how bad it is. So I see him turning inwardly. He's turning inwardly because he's got enormous problems with criminality. He's got enormous problems with finding ways to create employment. He's got problems with millions and millions of illegal aliens that he has to find a way to deport. It's overwhelming. And so he's looking at what's going on in Ukraine. And truthfully, that war is over. It's lost. Ukrainians are being annihilated. Each passing day, it gets worse. So what do? What's the answer? Do you go in and demand a ceasefire? Come on. That's absurd. It's not going to happen.
So then how could he get out of Ukraine, though?
Oh, it's very simple. He could have gotten out months ago. He could have said exactly what he did when he was running for office. And that was, first of all, I didn't start this and I don't want it. I want to normalize relations with Russia. I want to do business with Russia. And we have no interest in this war in Ukraine whatsoever. He did not create the design, the strategy for Russia. The strategy for Russia from the moment this began, you got to go all the way back to 2014 Go back to the coup and Victoria Nuland and the gang and CIA and MI6 that engineered that. Everything was designed not for Ukraine's benefit. Nobody gave a damn about Ukraine. Ukraine was being weaponized. It was being turned into a battering ram for use against Russia. And it's failed. It's failed miserably. It's killed 1.8 million Ukrainian soldiers. For God's sakes, think about those numbers. They're horrendous. That's World War I level of destruction and damage. You can't survive that. And the Ukrainian nation may not survive this. That's how really bad it is. So he wants to end this. There's no doubt in my mind. But how do you walk in and do anything other than say, look, I want this to end. I've done everything I can, but I can't end it on my own. My allies want this war. Well, the Europeans don't want the war, but the governments in London, the government in Paris and Berlin, they seem to want the war. I do not want the war. So I'm going to withdraw everybody because there's no point in having any Americans on the ground in Ukraine. There's no point in pouring any more money into Ukraine. We can't win this. This is over. The Europeans, of course, are afraid of that because they know that if we walk out, they're on their own, which is where they belong. They should be on their own. And it's not going to last long once they are on their own.
But if NATO, I think we both agree that NATO played a key role in where we are today in the war in the first place. So if the US played a role in that war through multiple presidents, I wouldn't pinpoint one president, happened since the 90s. If that's the case, then isn't the US responsible to clean up the mess or support Ukraine to a certain extent? And if so, to what level should the US support Ukraine? If we consider US responsible to some extent to the war in Ukraine.
The United States should provide as much as it can, whenever it can, through third countries, humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. That makes sense. I support that 100%. I would support that for Iraq, another place that we destroyed. We have got to get out of the business of destroying other people's countries. And that's what we've done in Ukraine. We did it in Iraq. But I'm not interested in keeping this war on life support in perpetuity just to satisfy the Europeans. And I don't think President Trump is either. Now, can he do that? Can he walk out of this and say, we had some very good talks, very good exchanges of views. And we did agree that we could potentially discuss future arrangements on nuclear weapons, because I know that President Trump is very sensitive to the nuclear issue. And that's something that I think he wants to pursue. He wants to put the nuclear genie, if you will, back into the bottle. A lot of people around him don't, but he does. I also think that President Trump wants to focus at home on the very serious issues that we confront as Americans inside our own society. So I think his inclination is to say, look, I've done all that I can do. I think this war should end, and I'm doing what I can to end it. And that means that we are getting ourselves out. We Americans are leaving because we want to do business with Russia. We want to normalize relations with Russia. We will provide humanitarian aid and assistance to the Ukrainians to the best of our ability. But if the Ukrainian government refuses to talk to Putin and discuss an end to this war, a legitimate end to the war based on realities that the battlefield has now created, then there's nothing we can do. And you're worried about NATO as being dead man walking for years. I mean,
what about the base? What about the base in Romania? Could negotiations include some, maybe removal of equipment or missile defense systems near the Russian border as part of a deal to give up less Ukrainian territory? So I think, like, if you look at Crimea, Donbass, I just struggle to see them still part of Ukraine after these negotiations. But maybe for Russia to pull out from some of the territory in Kherson and Zaporizhia. And then what would the US and NATO would do is maybe cancel or pause or reduce the size of the Romanian NATO base, which is going to be the biggest base in Europe, and move away some of their equipment and missile defense systems near the Russian border.
Well, if you're a Russian, I'm sure that would be music to your ears. But I think the Russians know that we're on the road to national bankruptcy. And as a result, we'll probably pull these things out anyway. Once we're broke financially, completely, once we can no longer sell our debt. Remember, we can't sell the treasuries now at this point anyway. So now we're trying to use the T-bills, the treasury bills. That's not going very well. And I think Besant is doing everything he can, but I don't think he's going to make that game work. So I think if you're a Russian, you probably figure, and with some justification, a lot of what you just described is going to happen anyway. I think the Russians are preeminently concerned about the larger security architecture in Europe. And that's something that we have steadfastly refused to discuss. And at this point, given President Trump's position, which is not very strong, I don't think he could deliver on a security architecture for Europe. I don't doubt that he might like to do that, but I just don't think he can do it anymore. The other thing is that what are the Russians going to believe? In other words, when you start talking about guaranteeing things, how do you know that your opponent, and we are the opponent at this point, is going to fulfill any of the the pledges? Is this Minsk III another exercise in nonsense where you promise things, you lie through your teeth, and nothing happens? If I were a Russian, I'd be very suspicious. The other thing is that if you go back and look at the Austrian State Treaty, which was signed in 1955 and resulted in the complete withdrawal of Soviet forces out of Austria so that Austria became neutral, fully neutral. There were guarantees at that point. And who provided them? Well, the man's name was Eisenhower. People believed President Eisenhower. He had credibility. When he spoke on these matters, he knew that the Congress would stand behind him. Everybody knew that the legislature would stand behind President Eisenhower. And what else did Eisenhower say at that point? Because he absolutely did not want a war with Russia. He said we should try to neutralize more states in Eastern Europe because we Americans don't have the military power with which to defend these places. So whatever we can do to neutralize more states is in our interest as well as in the Soviet interest. Have you ever heard anything like that come out of the mouth of Donald Trump? No. Donald Trump has signed on for this phony narrative that you were reiterating earlier. Russia is evil. Russia is losing. Russia can't sustain the war. Russia is backward. Russia's manufacturing base is inadequate. Russia is just a gas station with nuclear weapons. Come on. You got to drop this. That's just nonsense. And Russia is stronger and more powerful today, I think, than it's been certainly since the early 1980s. So I think we ought to get back to reality. The problem is, how do you get to reality if you're Donald Trump? You're surrounded by all these people say, oh, wait a minute, boss. You can't do that. That'll look like a win for the Russians. What's a win? A win is no war. That's the win. Deal with reality. Remember Bonaparte, one of my favorite people? He's sitting right behind me. Somebody said, well, the Pope says, you really should do X, Y, and Z. And Bonaparte turned to the general at the table and said, how many battalions has the Pope got? All right. You're going to the table now with Putin. These people are professionals, diplomats and soldiers, highly trained, highly schooled. They understand power. They have been in power for years. They know what they want. They know what must be done. Who are we? Donald Trump, who gets elected the second time around because he sold his soul to donors who want him to wage perpetual war in the Middle East, donors that hate Russia. And who are these people that are sitting next to him? What kind of experience and background do they have? It's a joke. Don't be ridiculous.
It reminds me of a quote by President Putin.
Tough-minded people.
Do you remember that quote by President Putin? It was like, I meet a president, we agree on something, and then men in black suits come back and discuss something completely separate. Do you remember that quote? I can't remember what he said exactly, but essentially what I think he's implying is that the presidents don't really make the final decision, or at least not in his interactions.
Yes, well, I think he's right on that, and I think this has been going on for some years. But on the other hand, I don't think it's always been the case, but I think it's been the case certainly since Clinton was in office. But the difference between the era when Clinton was in office and now is profound. We were a much stronger country economically, financially, and in terms of social cohesion. We're not that strong now, and that's something else the Russians are aware of. So if you're going to talk to the Russians, you've got to agree to the facts up front. You can't make an agreement with people if your set of facts is completely divorced from theirs. This is very important. If you're going to repeat the narrative that you started with, the Russians are going to go, oh, sit there and close their eyes. And if I were Putin, I'd say, come on, we'll fly you to eastern Ukraine. We'll fly you out there. You can see what's happening. That happened to me after the Kosovo air campaign. I went down there to look at the so-called battle damage assessment, which, by the way, was bullshit. The BDA was just nonsense, pitched by NATO, okay? And I went down there because I said, I need to know for myself. And the British 3-star at that point, who later became chief of staff, who was in command, he said, look, I'll give you a Range Rover, and you can drive all over Kosovo, and you can see the battle damage in about 15 to 20 minutes, because we really hadn't inflicted any. 78 days of the air campaign, and what damage had we done to the troops that were in Kosovo? Almost none. So what I'm telling you is I've been down this road before. I know how this works. You create a lie. It becomes a myth. It's fiction, but everybody has to support it. And then he handed me a telegram when I came back from seeing the BDA. And it said, today, the Supreme Commander Europe is going to make an announcement of battle damage assessment. Regardless of what he says, you will support his statement. So he handed it to me and he said, they're going to stand up there and lie. And he was right. That's what we did. Well, we could get away with it. After all, it was little Serbia. You can't just lie your way out of this stuff with the Russians. And that's the problem right now. Everybody has been lying repeatedly for the last 3+ years about what's happening in Ukraine. Not going to be able to do that much longer.
Just on our position, I think we agree on most things on what's happening on the battlefield. Just to make sure my stance is clear, I think Russia has the upper hand. I think what we disagree is how much of an upper hand they have. You're obviously more of an expert than I am, but I definitely don't see things as like ideological simplifications, like Russia's evil, Ukraine's evil, the US is evil. The politics is a lot more complex than that. But I definitely do see, Russia is gaining territory. No one could deny that.
It doesn't matter.
Now,
the territory is irrelevant. That's what people don't get. I've tried to tell you that before. It's the destruction of Ukrainian military power. It's the destruction of the Ukrainian state because it can't sustain itself and support itself. Has no means of doing so. That's what the Russians have been interested in doing. They've largely accomplished that mission. That's why I've tried to tell you, if the Russians lose 20 or 30 people a day and the retreating Ukrainian forces are losing 1,000 a day, what's the outcome? Well, it's very obvious. Ukraine's lost the war. You keep going back to territory because that's where Zelensky wants everybody to focus. The Russians already control the territory that is largely historically Russian. Not everything, but most of it. But that is not the goal here.
Do you think Trump's strategy of secondary tariffs targeting India, which is something that Biden has not done, could that help Ukraine, Europe, and the US's negotiating position?
No, it's immensely stupid. India is a long-time friend of Russia. They have a great deal in common. They've always supported each other. And the Indians don't give a damn what we threaten. This is back to the other thing that we were talking about earlier. President Trump thinks that we are still the center of the world as the world's economic power and supermarket, if you will. We're not. China is. And if you're pushed into a corner and you're asked, well, do I do business with China or do I do business with the United States? Or do I do business with Russia or do I do business with the United States? People look at the two and say, well, as long as I have access to China's markets, and if you look at BRICS and all the people that are lining up to join it, that's most of the world's population. As long as I have access to those markets, I'm going to join that. So go ahead with your tariffs. Fine. I'll go elsewhere. I think President Trump is finding that out. And if you look at his initial threats, 100% tariff suddenly becomes 50% tariff, suddenly becomes 25% tariff, and it keeps going down because he has no leverage.